And we are live again. Hello, everybody. It's me. My name is Anton Arhipov. I'm a developer advocate at JetBrains and Kotlin team, responsible for server-side aspects of Kotlin. And today we are going to talk about Ktor, a Kotlin native web framework, or basically a toolkit that we are building at JetBrains. It's going to be basically an entry point for Ktor at our webinar series. Today we are talking about Ktor from the ground up, basically an intro, an overview of different aspects of the framework. And tomorrow we have a session with Viktor Gamov integrating Ktor with Kafka. That will be a nice, interesting application. So this is my plan for today. I'm going to explain the very basics. I'm going to walk over the features of the framework, show you some demos. Due to some technical difficulties, I will not be doing live coding and will not be recompiling code too much because of the screen sharing and IntelliJ and other tooling when they work on the same machine at the same time. It's not very convenient and not very performant experience. So in front of you, I have a list of things I want to go over today about the minimal example. I have some links in here. I have this list published in Checklist, and there is a public link if you want to follow along the lines. I will actually paste this plan into the chat, and we, as time permits, we go over the list and we'll see all those features. And as the presentation goes, I will untap some of the items in the list as well. Before we start, it's actually interesting how many of you know about Ktor, the framework itself. Have you tried it before? Please type in the chat if you have used Ktor before or you have not ever used it, and if you are using something else, it's interesting, like what kind of framework have you used before, and if you are considering moving to Ktor. So it would be a useful information for us to know where people come from and if they would like to learn about Ktor and what exactly they would like to learn about Ktor. So the website of the framework is Ktor.io. And the very first thing you see at the website is a minimalistic example of web server implemented with Ktor. So let me see, where's my ID? I will actually open the same example here, and didn't close the previous demo. Sorry for that. So let me see. The source code for the demo I have on GitHub and in my repository. So let me see. GitHub Anton Arhipov /Ktor demo. So this is the repository I'm going to work with. The README file is actually generated by the wizard, so it's not really exactly the same thing that I'm showing today, because I generated the project and then I was making edits to the source code, but I didn't modify the README file, so don't really follow the README file this time. And let's start with this simple example here. So where's the ID again? Exactly. So the simple example is with the embedded server. So here it is. What do you see here? It's just a function invocation with two parameters: the engine that is going to be used for running the server and the port. Right. So on with net engine with port 8000, we are going to start the embedded server, and there will be one route running, responding hello world to all the requests. Nothing really special. However, we can see that inside the block here, inside the method, which is actually a third parameter for the server. So the first one is the engine, the second one is the port, and the third one is this application block that implements all the logic. So inside that block, we actually can write something like installing more features and more functionality, and like install, let's say, default headers. Something like this, and then this feature will work. I will not start recompiling this thing because otherwise it takes ages with screen sharing. So, but this is like very minimal. You don't have then any kind of extra functionality provided by the framework, like configuration. So if you need to read some configuration, you will have to do it yourself. You will have to implement all the logic yourself. Read in the properties file, or read in Hakon file, or anything else like XML, whatever. So it's up to you how you do it. If we want a little bit more support from the framework, we'll have to use the engine, like the engine API. And that is a little bit different. Example, this application, when you generate the application for the first time, this is what you will see. This is what will be generated. And actually, let's run the wizard. I'm not going to create like the full project, but I'm going to show you how it looks like. There is a new project wizard for Ktor. Let's see if it actually is able to run with screen sharing. Is it? I hope so. All right, so there is a Ktor plugin. If you install it to your instance of IntelliJ, you will see this new menu item Ktor, and it provides all kind of fields that you want to fill in, like webinar, for instance. We use Gradle Kotlin with Kotlin DSL, the website for the package name. So it will the default package will be com.example, Ktor version, and then we may choose any of the engines, and default one is Netty. Of course, there are other options like Jetty or Tomcat or CIO, which stands for coroutines IO, which is kind of an experimental engine, but we usually stick with Netty. Next, and there is a very nice list of different features that you may want to include in your application, and we go over some of them today. Let's say we want to respond HTML, use the DSL, and if you click on the feature in the list, we actually get a nice documentation on the side, how it could be used, how we like different examples, how we can implement all kind of templating logic with this DSL, or if we may choose free marker, we also get an example of how to use free marker with Ktor. So if we add this functionality, the wizard will actually tell us that we may need some other features to be enabled with the framework. Click yes, and then we click finish. We basically create the new project. It generates a skeleton, which is an empty application with some small examples depending on which features you have enabled. I will not generate the project. Instead, this is exactly the same project that I have generated. I just added a bunch of different features into it. So when you do it like this, you will get an application.kt file in the package. Basically, it will be a single Kotlin file in the application in the beginning. And then you will see two configuration files under the resources folder. One is the application.conf, where you can, configure stuff, and logback.xml basically for logging. I haven't really touched it, so this one was generated. So deployment part, right? So if we want to configure the port, and by default it should be 8080 for us. And if we want to override it with any of the environment variables, we may choose to write this part, the assignments for the second time with this special syntax like $ and question mark and then the variable name, and it will override the default parameter. Then a very important part is the application part in the configuration, where we specify the modules, the list of modules that are included into the application. So Ktor is basically a collection of modules, and that's basically a convention. You may call those different parts of your application however you want. You may call them packages, you may call them modules, you may call them functions, however. So the module itself is actually a function. So application.kt file contains a module function, which is an extension function to the application, and that is for a reason, right? So whenever we work inside that application function, we actually will have the access to all the internals of the application class. So we will have access to configuration objects. We will have access to anything else like the pipeline of the framework, so we can extend it easily. So let's go over the first examples here. So when we go to the first function, simple, I have just separated them into different files. However, all the functions may be just inlined into this application.kt file. It will be just very long, but that is the way how you kind of structure your application. You say that, okay, logically it belongs to the same part, so I will extract it and put to a different file, and it will run as an extension function for the application class. Good enough. So inside that simple method, we have an option to do whatever we want. Like for this specific case, for instance, we can configure routing. Like in our first example, when we use the embedded server, we have this route that responds hello world. The application is actually running right now, so I might want to test it. Localhost 8080. Yes, it responds hello world. So some of the examples will work, and some of the examples are not really configured fully, so they may not work. But those that I'm convinced that they're working, we will try out as well. Let's see. Okay, let's see some more sophisticated examples. So we don't usually respond with plain text. We sometimes implement some parts of the application using HTML, right? Like it's called server-side rendering. Right, and then respond with that content. So the call object here has respond HTML function, where we can kind of implement our HTML response by using this DSL provided from the external library. And it's interesting how we can actually mix and match different constructs within the same block. So we have a DSL block which starts with body, then we have a header, and then we have another HTML kind of DSL construct, and inside that we suddenly see a loop, right? So in the loop we can generate the other elements. Let's see how it works in the demo. So let's switch to the browser. HTML, DSL. Nice. So it's very simple, right? What I recently discovered when I had to play with creating documents like this is that you may have different pages that share the same logic, and you still use not a templating engine, but you use this DSL, and how Kotlin actually helps to create common part and then inject the other parts that are different into the same document. So imagine I have some sort of a document that I implement with this DSL, Kotlin X HTML library. There is a head in the document, there is a body, and that is a common part. But then I need to serve different pages which will have a different title, and it may have a different whatever else, whatever you come up with. But just for the simple example here, and I have 2 pages right now. So basically, they share the same functionality within the block of code I will call the common method. But since I'm passing in a lambda with extension or like with the receiver, which should be called within the context of the head tag. So that's the title, right? So title should be inside head. I can pass in this block of code as a parameter. In the first case, it takes title page 1. In the second case, it takes title page 2. Well, just a simple example how easy it's to combine different functions to get like slightly different behavior for the same thing. All right. There is also like style CSS implementation, basically very similar to HTML document generating. We have the same for CSS, and then you can actually mix those two as well, like create an HTML document that refers to the styles CSS, and it will color and add some styles to your documents. Let's see, what do I have in the list? How much have I covered already? Like we talked about the minimal app. It's actually also on GitHub in a separate repository. We talked about the embedded server. We have seen the basic example of the application with the configuration file and the project wizard, of course. We talked about the application.module. Actually, let's talk about it more in a second. HTML, we covered that. We will cover testing in a second. We talked about the application.conf. All right, and we talked about engine, and we talked a little bit about Hakon. All right, let's talk about the configuration file a little bit more. So there is a configuration file that normally by default it's the application.conf. You may change the location of the file, so you may provide a property that basically points to your configuration file, whatever the name is and whatever the location is, by specifying a command line parameters. So in the program arguments, you will put like config equals and a path to your configuration file. Right. So the configuration format, of course, is described in the documentation. You will find it, or you can just use the example which is generated normally. The interesting part is that it's a very minimalistic. It doesn't have a lot of properties to configure. What you may want to look at is the modules list, right? So we have one module specified, but it's actually a list we can specify a lot of them, like com, example, what else we have? Async, for instance, module, right? So whatever file I have here, actually it's async, right? It can be a different name. It can be as many different modules as you want. It doesn't matter. It just provides you a flexibility to have all the code in the same project, and then by using the configuration file, you may decide which instance or which functionality of the application should be turned on. Another part is that you may add your own configurations or your own properties here, and then you have the API to actually parse those properties. Let me see in the list, where do I have it? So we talked about the configuration file and working with Hokon, right? So we talked about Hokon. Let me see if I have it in the example. Yes, right. So remember, I was talking about the ability to access the application context within the extension function. So if I add the extension function to the application class, I will have access to the environment field of that application, and then config field of the environment field gives me the access to that configuration file. And in that configuration file, by calling a method called config, I will get actually a reference to that custom block of configuration inside my configuration file. And then by accessing a property or calling a property method or property or null, I will get the property value. And then I will have to decide which one should it be. Should it be a string or should it be a list? In my case, in this configuration file that I have two keys, which are basically the just single values, right? Okay, I suddenly have less light now, but anyways, don't worry. Don't worry, I will cope with less light this time. Okay, so we talked about getting the custom configuration from our configuration file. We talked about the extension functions and getting access to the internals of the application class. Let's talk a little bit about testing. What's in there? So what's in there? We have a simple test in that demo, which is basically what? It's a Kotlin test, and there is a single method, and it provides this with test application method that invokes our current module. The module is the application itself, right? So let's see what's the function. So application.module will be invoked, and then it makes a request to the given path. It's a GET request, and it expects that there will be a status code and there will be a text in the response, right? So just very basic tests, and you can use it as example to implement your own tests for your application. Very simple. All right. So what's in the list? What's in the list? Kotlin demo. So now we are finally at the demo itself. Like let's go over different features that I have in the list and slightly discuss them. I talked about the HTML blocks already, so I will not cover them again. Let's go talk about content negotiation. So content negotiation is a feature. Mostly it's about serialization. So if you think that you need to respond with JSON from the backend to the frontend, it's pretty often the use case. We have a few options for you. So content negotiation is the feature that you have to install in your application, and then you may decide which implementation you actually want to use. Should it be JSON? Should it be Jackson? Should it be Kotlin X serialization? So whenever you install the content negotiation feature, you will actually have to configure which one you prefer. Let's see, the application is running and there is a customer. So how it works, right? So for the request mapping at the customer context path, we have a code that responds with the JSON by serializing the data class here, customer, that has 3 fields: ID, name, and email, and it will serialize to JSON and just respond back to the UI. So if we invoke this, we can see pretty printed JSON block. All right. What else? After JSON, we have a module called web app. So in here, we have 2 features. Webjars. So if you use Webjars for dependency management, for the front-end dependency management, it's something that you will like, of course. You don't have to commit the JavaScripts into your Git repository. You can use Webjars for that, and just download them as dependencies, and Webjars will help serving them to the UI. And then WebSockets. WebSockets are so important. We actually have a dedicated top-level item for WebSockets in the documentation. So Ktor itself is a framework or a toolkit for building connected applications, right? It provides you the server-side framework that we are talking about today, but it also has a client, and we have it reflected in the documentation. So there is like a subtree for server and subtree for client. But as you can see, we have a subtree for WebSockets separately, like a dedicated subtree for WebSockets. It's so important and so popular. So we decided to have it on the top level. Let's see. Okay, so WebSockets. We install the WebSocket. We configure the WebSocket in the installation configuration. And then in the routing context, we are configuring an endpoint, which is also like a WebSocket call. But it will follow the upgrade request, and it may stay on the same path, right? So we actually had a route which already is mapped on this slash on the root context path, but we can still put a WebSocket on the same path, and when the upgrade request comes, it will be upgraded to WebSocket endpoint. And well, there are different ways how to implement handling of the frames, depending on what logic you have. Do you have to handle the exceptions from different API calls, or don't have to? There are different examples you may find on the internet. On our website, play.kotlinlang.org, you can actually find a very nice tutorial about building a chat application with Ktor and WebSockets. Right, so it was implemented by one of my colleagues, Sebastian Eigner, and it's very well written. You can find all kind of instructions, how to start with the project, how to test it, how to play with it, and so on. So much recommended. I will not actually go over the example here today because it will take time and computation resources, of course. The next example, the next is like a very long list of different features. Actually, I would rather recommend watching a presentation by Hadi Hariri about Ktor, where he goes over all those features one by one, demonstrating them, like which features like implement what and what kind of headers and which situations they add. It's just like a showcase example here, like for different features. Like if you want to implement double receive, like allow receiving the content twice, or conditional headers, depending on the header type, you may implement some logic, or logging the different calls of the application, adding compression, responding with the default headers, or caching the headers, or implementing CORS functionality or expect. So all kind of things, right? And those features are actually listed in the documentation with all the examples as well. It's just that I don't want to spend time on all the things that you can actually read in the documentation, and I don't want to spend too much time in the webinar. What I want to do is to give you the pointers where to look at the things and what's possible, and then if you're interested, it will be useful for you to look at the things. Now, before we proceed, I would actually like to ask from the audience if you use Ktor, right? If you use Ktor today, what kind of features do you use? Please type in the chat or in the comments to the video, whatever. It will be interesting to know for the team. It will be interesting to know what features are the most popular ones, and if there is any feedback about the features of the framework. What do you miss in the framework? What do you want to the framework to include in the future releases? That's your opportunity to give the feedback. All right, let's see what else do we have here. Routing. So one of the things that people are often asking from us is that how do you structure the application and how do you structure the routes in the application? So for instance, if we look at very simple example here, which is on purpose, it's made slightly more complex so that you would realize what kind of problems you would have if you just start randomly adding those paths to the same place and will not care about the structure of your routes. Even this small example already takes the full screen and becomes quite complex, quite inconvenient to maintain. Maybe you have some logic that you want to share between those different parts. In fact, those routes are, they are extension methods, or they are not extension methods, but they can be refactored to become extension methods. And the normal practice is actually to group them, right? So you group the different parts of the logic, of the routing logic, and extract them into separate files, for instance, or like separate functions even for the beginning. So if we look at this structure example, you may extract the different different mappings into the extension functions for the root class, and then invoke those extension functions in your routing logic. And this way you will actually group the different different parts of the routing logic into sensible things, sensible functions that you will maintain more easily and will not have any problems reading this code. Next, authentication is also possible. In the documentation we have more examples. I have only two here, just the basic authentication. Basically what you need to do, you install the feature called authentication, where you configure the authentication method. For instance, you say basic, right? Or there are different other options like digest or JWT or anything else, or LDAP, for instance. But in this basic block, you also provide a name for this basic block, so it will be auth. And then you provide the logic how to validate the how to take care of the login, for instance, how to validate the credentials. And then you use this name of this block auth in your routing logic. So you are going to wrap the mapping. So in this case, get mapping is secure, secured by this authentication method. Let's see how it works. Secure. It's going to ask me the password, and the validation logic is currently saying that the username and the password should match. So if I type A and put a password A should be successful. So we access the secure area, right? Very simple example. There is another one like form authentication with the different basic authentication provider, and then we have also digest authentication example down in the code. In the documentation, you'll find the others as well. I just didn't have time to configure JWT example, but it's something that people would like to know about, and obviously we are going to take care of that and add this into documentation more. Location is an experimental feature. Locations API is the new experimental feature in Kotlin framework. So remember when I was showing you this big routing example, let me go back to that one. Structure, where was it? Let's see, routing app, right? So here we have all those names written out as strings, right? If we have to like program in strings, and we decided to kind of improve this bit of the framework a little bit. So locations API is such a interesting feature. It allows you to do type safe routing definitions in your routing logic. So instead of providing a string parameter for the get method, instead we have a parameterized generic method get, which takes some kind of a type. In this case, I have index, employee, employee list. So what are those types? Let's see. So for instance, index is just a class with a message field, message property, and there is a annotation called location, which takes a string as an argument. So we cannot get rid of strings, but we can kind of use this type information to implement some other nice things in the framework. So for instance, if we take a look at this example with employee class, right? We have 3 fields in the employee, and then we have a URL or a context path that matches this employee. So let's see how it works in the code. So there is an employee get method that will map to that URL that is specified by the location annotation. And the location annotation defines the order and how those different parts of the context should be mapped on the object. So the framework will take care of the conversion and serializing and deserializing the objects from the string, from the path string into the object, and then we will get those fields in this lambda. So actually, since the argument is not written out, I can do that for you. It's usually implicitly it's it, right? But if we ask it to add the type information, it will be employee, right? So the type information actually is specified as a generic type here. So the framework knows to which type it should serialize all those values, right? And in our case, let's see the example here. Employee. Imagine I get a list of employees from the database, right? I have Anton, Hadi, Leonid in the list. So here's the example, right? I get the list from database. Actually, not. It's just a collection of different employees. The list has values, different values, and I iterate over the collection by and generate the response. I respond with the HTML. And The locations feature can generate the different links from that data object, like from the employee, from the data class. Since it was annotated with the locations annotation, it knows how to generate the context path, right? So we generate the link, and if you go back to the there on the bottom, you probably don't see it really well, but if I click, let's say Anton, here's the generated URL or context path, right? So from that Anton employee data class, the locations.href function generated this context path for me. And I didn't have to compose it myself inside that response block. Okay, and if we access anything, let's say let's change this URL, since we are not actually retrieving the objects from the database. Whatever we write in the URL will be serialized by the framework, and the framework will just respond with the text, which is exactly the same, same values taken from the context path. So if I change it, let's say to Ktor, the project name will be Ktor in the HTML. So the interesting feature that goes along the way with locations feature is called data conversion. So there is a data conversion feature, which is also installed right here, where you can specify your own converters for the specific values. So you may serialize and deserialize from the lists of string to the typed object to some class, and vice versa, if you need to deserialize it again. In this case, in my employees class that I have in my example, this employee class, there is one field called which is of type local date, and if I want to take this local date and make sure that it's is deserialized into a correct type, I can add my own conversion logic. So this converter that I have installed in this data conversion feature will match that there is a local date converter, and whenever I have to deserialize some of the values from the location, the location is our employees class, it will detect that there is a local date field, and we have a converter for that. And this is the logic that I need to invoke in case I will match the type, right? So whenever it sees that there is a parameter for that location that matches the type, it will take the value and will parse from that value, using this local date parse method. So this way I will get, a constructed object. Where is that? Here. So this in this block, the employee, let's say employee, instead of it, will have an explicit name, employee. And here as well, employee. And here's to employee. So that DOB will be of correct type, and that's exactly the local date. I hope it was clear enough. The example is pretty simple, but sometimes it's not so easy to understand how the thing actually works. Next one, we have error handling. So you may want to handle the errors in your application, like depending on which application error happens. Like if your application throws some exception. Some application logic is implemented in a way that it throws an exception. You didn't handle it. So as a top level handler in your application, you may install the status pages feature, and then depending on the exception type, you may want to choose to show some specific page, right? So, for instance, if there is a just we may want to implement even the most top level handler using handling throwable, for instance, throwable, right? And then respond somehow with some specific page, like error 500 or something like that. All right. I think I have just a couple of features left to show, and we are getting to the end. So the very last thing in my list is the async feature. Since Ktor is now implemented fully in Kotlin, it obviously has all kind of how to say it, possibilities to use all things in Kotlin, right? So this time it has the possibility to use coroutines. And in this example that I have, you may take a look at this a bit later in the repository. You may run some benchmarks on this, how it works. So the idea is that you may have some wrong running or blocking operation in your application logic. In here we have just a delay that delays for some milliseconds, and then you may want to run it in a separate pool so that the threads are not blocked. The application threads are not getting blocked. In this example, we are using the executor service, which is a Java executor service, by the way, the fixed thread pool of 4, but we use it as a coroutines dispatcher, right? So instead of running threads there, we are running coroutines. And just with 4, the size of 4, we are able to actually run 100 concurrent requests on my machine. Just before the webinar, I have tried that. It took 6 seconds, right? And the average time for the response was about 3 seconds, which basically shows or proves that it's all handled concurrently. And this is the way it's implemented. So we have a suspending function, respond handling long calculation, and inside that block, this is where the blocking operation happens. This delay provider is executed, which artificially creates a long running computation. So that loop is actually executed within context of that thread pool, right? So we start the new coroutines on that thread pool, and block there, and they all all run concurrently within 6 seconds, instead of blocking the operations and running for 60 seconds, for instance. Let's see what's on my list today. We talked about different features already, and I don't want to go into implementing custom feature today, but we will do that tomorrow for Kafka. More sample apps. So what you will not find at the website directly for some reason is that there is a Ktor samples repository on GitHub, which actually shows a lot of interesting stuff there. So What you may want to look at is this kwit repository that is basically a very good sample of using exposed library for accessing the database. And another one is ucube, an interesting example which implements uploading and viewing different video files from the specific location, and it uses locations API as far as I remember, and Kotlin X HTML. So those are two examples I give you as a homework to take a look at. I will not go over them today because I see that our time is running out. Often I get questions if it's possible to use Swagger or OpenAPI with Ktor, and apparently it is possible. There are different repositories that you can find in GitHub that implement exactly that functionality. And of course, different tutorials by our team you can find at play.kotlinlang.org. There is a bunch of different tutorials already. If you want to learn about some aspects of the framework and you didn't find them in the tutorials, that would be interesting to learn for us. So give us the feedback if you need some specific part to be covered in the tutorials. We will do our best to cover that as well. All right, so I think this is all I wanted to talk about today. I mentioned again that was the entry point for Ktor. We are going to do more webinars about Ktor quite soon. Tomorrow we have a webinar with Kafka and Ktor and Kotlin for a very nice demo. Let's see what's up with the questions, folks. Do you have any questions from me, or do you have any wishes? What should be covered in our webinars? Please let us know, and please comment to the video. If you didn't subscribe to our YouTube channel yet, I think you should do that, and that's the indication for us if we are doing interesting stuff. And good luck, and see you tomorrow. Come to our webinar tomorrow. That will be interesting. Thank you.